Most of them reiterate the common theme of inspiring through a moral lifestyle. Influence does not require a title, a different pay grade, a corner office, or a newsletter. Leadership is simply the art of influencing others. This is Pints with Jack, Season 5, Episode 39. The Leadership of C.S. Lewis. After Hours with Dr. Crystal Hurd. Good morning, everyone. Pints with Jack is your weekly C.S. Lewis podcast where David, Andrew, and I break down and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis. This season, we've been talking about love, and we worked our way through Lewis's book, The Four Loves. This month, we've been celebrating Ecumenism Month, talking with people who love C.S. Lewis from a diverse range of religious backgrounds: Calvinism, Eastern Orthodox, Mormonism, and Judaism. But today, we're officially leaving Ecumenism Month behind and speaking with a former guest of the show who has just brought out a new book about Lewis, Dr. Crystal Hurd. In some background, Dr. Crystal Hurd is an educator and researcher from Virginia, where she lives with her husband and two dogs. Over the past decade, she has read and researched both biographically and rhetorical aspects of C.S. Lewis. Her dissertation applied transformational leadership theory to his life and works. She is currently working on a book titled The Leadership of C.S. Lewis, which will be published in 2022 by Winged Lion Press. Additionally, she is the 2020 recipient of the Clyde S. Kilby Research Grant, awarded by the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College. Her research will be developed into a book exploring the artistic influences of Lewis's parents and grandparents, titled Bookish, Clever People. If that wasn't enough, she also serves as visiting faculty in Inkling Studies for Northwinds Theological Seminary, serves as the reviews editor for Sinzuk, teaches in the Romantic Theology program, and is launching a brand new program on Inklings in creative writing. But most importantly, and which is what we're here for about today, is now the author of The Leadership of C.S. Lewis. Dr. Crystal Hurd, welcome back to Pints with Jack. It's so good to have you back.
Thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure.
Absolutely. I always choose a quote from the book as I'm reading it in preparation for the episodes. And I came across that one and I really liked it because so much I feel like today of leadership, we talk about it from this top-down perspective, and this talks about it seems like a little bit more from a bottom-up perspective. It doesn't require a title, a different pay grade, a corner office, or a newsletter. It's inspiring through a moral lifestyle. And I also felt that really teased with some of the stuff that we're going to end up unpacking here today with your book. But that quote just really jumped out to me, and I liked it. And I actually thought to myself, I'm like, ooh, what a catchy title would be: Art of Influencing Others with C.S. Lewis. Like the Art of Winning Friends, that book, like Winning and Influencing Friends.
Influencing people, yeah.
That's the one.
Yeah, the Carnegie book. Yeah, that thing's been in print for like 70 years.
Yeah, that thing is unbelievable.
It's interesting when I was doing my leadership research, I was like you for so many years. I thought this is sort of a hierarchy where you're somewhere towards the bottom, and then other people who are important.
I'm at the bottom.
Yeah. I'm at the bottom. And then when I started really going into leadership studies and looking at different theories and skill-based theories, I realized that a lot of leadership is about personality and having a moral compass. And there's so much about the charisma of a leader that pulls people in and inspires people to follow them. And if that is done on a wide scale where we all sort of consider whom we influence, that could make such an impact on culture.
Mm-hmm. And not to jump ahead here too far, but I love that your book really focuses on that aspect of it, because my first exposure to this more idea of like transformational leadership, I did this 2-year thing in Chicago called the Transforming Center, where it takes leaders from the United States, and it's a Christian-based program. And the philosophy is going for a weekend retreat on leadership isn't going to most likely teach you that much in leadership, because your leadership is much more about the person you are than the knowledge that you have of what it takes to be a leader. And so that's why they did it over 8 quarters. And in the quarters in between, you'd read like 3 or 4 books. You'd be meditating, you'd be doing scripture readings, you'd be really just trying to transform as a person. And that's what makes the great leaders. And your book just reminded me, brought me back to that place, because there's just so many lessons in your book that are inspiring and encouraging of the different principles and virtues that we need to become a great leader. And so I am particularly excited for this. When David shared with us all different people he wanted to bring on this season, me, Andrew, and him are doing a 3-way call, and I'm like, I want to do that one. I want to take the Lewis and leadership one. That just sounds right up my alley, working in the business world, and I always just aspire to understand more about leadership. So I'm excited. That's a long way of saying I'm excited for this interview, and thank you for writing this book.
Me too. And I almost didn't write this book.
No way.
Yeah, it was because you know how it is when you have a dissertation, I literally spent 9 months working on it like I would if I were having a child. And it really felt like it at some point. Minus the hospital bill. But it was stressful. And so when I first finished it, everybody was encouraging me to publish it. And I said, I think, not to sound like George Costanza, but it's not you, it's me. Like I need a break from it to sort of wrap my head around it. And I started, working on a degree in creative writing, sort of stepped away from it for a little while, and and then sort of the political landscape was changing and shifting in our country and in other countries. And so I did a lot of thinking and praying, and I said, and then when the pandemic hit and I had a lot of time to be at home and think about the projects I was working on, I said, well, if I don't do it now, I'll never do it. Literally the slate's been wiped clean. I'm sitting here every day playing Animal Crossing for a few hours. This is God's opportunity, to kick me, in the booty and say, it's time to write that book. It's time for you to do that. And, it's really crazy, because when I wrote it, it was kind of a means to an end, even though I enjoyed it. It was, a requirement for my degree. And I think I checked the other day, and it's been downloaded over 3,500 times from the website at East Tennessee State. And then other people have said, "Oh, I recently read a dissertation with your leadership research in it." And so it's sort of, it was a kind of an idea that God surprised me with, and then He said, "I need you to do this." And so it was begrudging at times, but after the pandemic hit, I just decided I'm going to step on the gas and devote myself to doing this. And so, and here we are, a couple of years after the pandemic has started, I guess it's endemic now. And the book is finished, and I'm really happy with how it turned out. And for me, it's a different way of looking at leadership. I did have people even say, I really don't see leadership that way. And that's
like
okay.
about the thesis one that was online.
Yeah, I actually had people turn down doing an interview during the process of doing interviews for the dissertation. Like I had people say, I really don't see him as a leader. So yeah. And
after reading your book, it seems so evidently obvious.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of people who said, don't you think you're stretching it a little? And I said, actually, no, I really don't. Because if you're looking at leadership through a narrow focus, you might say, yeah, well, he doesn't really fit the qualities of it, and he really didn't even like, policy and leadership and all that stuff. But the fact was, it was spiritually, he was a huge leader. And when we sort of expand our worldview to look at the ways that people influence others, how many people have you had on the show who said, reading C.S. Lewis changed my life?
Everyone. And the amount of emails we get about it is massive.
This is a person who did not intend to become a leader, but has definitely transformed into a leader because of his devotion to obedience to God and to Scripture. There's so much that's part of leadership. That's just part of being a good human being, and being obedient. And like I've said in the book several times, leading is really about serving, which is a different way to look at it.
Well, in connecting off that, you and I were chatting pre-recording. Some of those emails or feedback you got on the thesis, maybe pushing back on it, calling it a stretch, I would argue is more of a symptom of the lack of leadership we have today. I feel like there's the model today of leadership is people want the loudest, they want the most powerful from an influence, money, control, authority, but it's very much like I use the word top-down authority. And your book, I would argue, is a much more powerful form of leadership that we seem to have lost in this social media, technology, media-driven world where it's all about who can just get the quickest amount of influence. And the thing is, I'm not even sure I would count. I would argue a real leader can rally people from many different backgrounds. Today, we have a ton of quote unquote leaders that are in their camps where they have a bunch of people that believe the same thing they believe. And it's really easy to get to your niche of that with social media and the way people curate that. And so that was really refreshing in your book to be able to see what I would argue is a much purer form of leadership and beautiful, authentic form of leadership.
And Jesus, I feel, is our best example.
Oh, yes.
Jesus was not CEO. Jesus was not called a manager. But the things he did, and he did serve, and he's definitely, Jesus is definitely a huge example of what we call servant leadership, which I talk about a little in the book. But I honestly don't know any Christian who would argue Jesus isn't the leader.
Yes.
Obviously, that you're following him right now. your life is transformed right now through these precepts, but it doesn't fit, this sort of conventional idea of what leadership is. And what I've discovered through a lot of, just sort of not just observation, but through a lot of reading and research, is that people are naturally drawn to good and decent people. We are naturally drawn to those people, and we want to emulate those people. So it's actually a really natural process if we think about it. Doing the right thing and being principled and having authentic concern for other people, that is something that is just naturally attractive for us. We can see that, we can sense that.
So turning to the book now, you've already alluded to in the beginning how this came about from turning your thesis, your dissertation into a book from the pandemic. But let's go back to the very original start of this idea of Lewis and leadership with the dissertation and thesis. Where did that interest come from? What piqued it and what got you to get the ball rolling on writing that?
Honestly, it's actually a very practical reason. I was doing an educational leadership program because as I'm a teacher, during the day, and one of the things that we had to do, of course, is a dissertation, and so we had to sort of choose what topic we were interested in, and it was pretty wide open. Mine was a little unconventional for several reasons, because a lot of people usually do surveys, and they they look at some sort of issue that's prominent in public schools, and then they write a thesis up, and they do all this stuff. And at the time, I love C.S. Lewis, and I really wanted an excuse to read all of his books.
That's a great reason.
So I was like, So at the time, I remember looking at the transformational leadership sort of outline and thinking, Lewis actually meets a lot of these criteria, right? He had to have intellect, which he had. He had to have charisma, which I feel he had. He had to have concern for others, which he had. And I was looking at all these, all these aspects of transformational leadership, and I said, he hits the mark on all of these. Maybe accidentally, because he wasn't attempting to be a leader. And I allude, to some the history, where his father was a very prominent figure in Belfast politics and government agencies. And he was a leader. He was literally on sort of the forefront of a lot of the local issues in politics, and that's one of the reasons why Lewis hates politics, is because he heard it so much in his own house growing up.
Always, everything goes back to childhood.
Yeah, not to be Freudian, but yeah, there's a whole lot there to unpack. But he was literally just being obedient and following scripture, and that's what made him a leader. So yeah, he seemed to just satisfy all the requirements. And so I actually went to someone on the faculty and I said, I'd like to do this. And they said, we don't have anybody here who can do that. Do something else. And so I switched advisors. So I just switched advisors.
I love the stubbornness.
I had another advisor who was like, I think that's a great idea. And I was just like, okay. So we just made signed a paper and just sallied forth.
That is so good.
And then it came to be. It was really cool how it came together, honestly. Like God is in the small things. There's so many things I could tell you about where God just lined things up. And I actually, the department had no idea, but I proposed on Lewis's birthday, which is November 29th. And I defended on his wedding anniversary.
Oh my goodness. That is incredible.
Yeah, the college had no idea. They were just here. How's this random date? And I just felt like, wow, God is all over this project.
Oh, for a second I thought you intentionally selected those. That was, oh my goodness, I got a little shivers right there.
That was just God showing off. It was really cool. And even people who came onto my committee, one of them, this never happens, but one of them asked me to be on the committee.
Whoa.
When she found out about my topic. Yeah. And I had one more spot. And she said, if you need anybody, I would love to serve. And I said, well, as a matter of fact, I do have a spot. I do have a vacancy if you're interested. So it's just a lot of cool things. And I just felt like, from the get-go, God was all over it. And, I was obedient. And I said, okay, God, let's do this. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun. But that was kind of how it started. And then over time, people kept asking me, are you going to, supply that as a modified version? And I had considered it and played with it. But like I said, until the pandemic, I didn't really have a whole lot of time to focus on it. And then when that happened, I said, this is my hour. Let's do it.
And yours this will segue right into the next question of, I'll let you obviously answer how the book's laid out and how you weave Lewis and leadership together. But I can tell the book would take a long time because it's not just like you've read a whole bunch of Lewis and you're streaming together a bunch of streaming of thoughts in a really good sense. Like you've done a huge amount of research on the topic objectively of leadership, irregardless of Lewis, take him out, in all of the different systematic ways people define leadership, and then unpacked those and then brought Lewis. And so it's like, that's not something that just happens overnight. And so there's a lot of reference research. And then of course there's the art of weaving in Lewis into it all. And so I thought it was beautiful, but I don't want to answer this question. So let's let you answer. How is the book laid out and how you weave Lewis and leadership together?
Oh, well, thank you. That was, thank you for the compliment. It did. It took me about a decade. The process of, and also one of the things is that, I wrote it 10 years ago. And so I've been through the last few years updating, including people like John Maxwell, Leighton Ford, Jim Collins' Good to Great, which is kind of a leadership staple. So I had to sort of go back to the drawing board a little bit and look at, take everything that I did for secular leadership study and then update it with Christian leadership studies to sort of make a blend for that. But I looked at Lewis through a trait-based, and transformative leadership is trait-based. And so I took different traits like humility, duty, creativity, courage. And I looked at those, and sort of defined those through a leadership lens, and then explored how Lewis satisfied those requirements. And resilience, that's a big one.
I really like the compassion, the
Yes,
moral,
compassion,
like
moral
morality, or
leadership.
that one.
Yeah, moral leadership was that's a big. There's a lot to unpack in that chapter.
Was probably my favorite. That and humility were probably my two favorite ones. I mean, I loved them all, but for me, with the moral leadership one, it really made me think so much of the 3-part morality and mere Christianity, and just the importance of, you can have these great rules to keep ships from not hitting each other, but if their rudders are crap, it's just not going to happen. And so, like, you can teach, going back to what we were mentioning earlier, you can teach people all of these great leadership traits, but if their morality is not there, it's just not going to happen.
Right. And they can still use those techniques for, they can pervert them, right? Because Lewis talks in Mere Christianity about good things being perverted, and they turn into bad things. It's really just good perverted. And I mean, leadership and anything, a lot of things are like that. You can take, there's transformational leadership, and then there's pseudo-transformational leadership, which I mentioned in the dissertation, but it's basically taking the same principles and being, using them for malevolent means. And I mentioned Hitler in my leadership study as one of the men who, in Lewis's time, was doing that. Because C.S. Lewis talks about in one of his letters how he was listening to the radio and Hitler was giving a speech. Obviously, it was being translated, but he says in the letter that Hitler is so charismatic and so passionate about his message that he's almost believable. And he says, I can understand how other people, could be pulled in to that.
Yeah.
But he understands too that the overarching message is still awful. And I cite a letter from 1933, right? And 1933 is, I think Hitler's first camp, Dachau, went operational in 1933. But a lot of people, you didn't know much about him on the world stage yet at that point, right? He didn't, he didn't actually really start a lot of his campaigns until 1939. Lewis is talking in a letter in 1933 about who is this man saying that it's his Christian duty to rid the earth of the Jews. He's like, his Christian duty.
I had no idea he wrote that.
Yeah, and I actually in the dissertation I actually cite one of Hitler's speeches, where he references his Christian duty and his it's God's, he's doing God's work by annihilating this whole race of people. Obviously that's ridiculous, ridiculous thinking, but at the time, he was saying things like that, and even Lewis, as early as 1933, was saying something is not right with this man. Something is not right with the way he's running things, and I talk some in the book about sort of Lewis having to balance out the bad with some of the good, and part of his job in Mere Christianity was restoring that hope to people.
Oh, and he did.
Yeah, and he knew how war impacted people because he was a soldier.
Yeah.
And he knew it. He knew what it was like, which I think he was so tickled to find out that a lot of the soldiers were listening to him during World War II.
I never thought about that balancing out. I wonder if that's why. So Mere Christianity is the thing that brought me back to Christianity. And I always tell people, it wasn't that it yet convinced me of the truth of Christianity. I wasn't quite sure yet, but when I finished it, I said to myself, there's so much beauty in this way of living that I can't not explore this. And I actually even said, even if it's not true, I would want to live this way. And so I'm wondering, now that you say that, he's countering such like evil going on. Like, that's why there was so much beauty weaved throughout it. You could also argue it's just, Christianity is just beautiful in general. So it was going to happen either way. But that's interesting to hear that context around the Hitler side really early on.
It was, I think he just, even though he wasn't a politically minded person, or he says he wasn't politically minded, but he had a lot to say on issues on moral issues of his day.
Yeah.
But he was literally in the midst of multiple dictators, doing awful things to people. And I think he saw God's leadership as something totally different. And, I reference 1 Corinthians 12 in that chapter on morality because, God states that we are the body and he is the head. And so, he says in a letter, if you're supposed to be a good toenail, then be a good toenail, which is what he says to one of his correspondents.
At least until you're clipped off.
Yeah. Got to keep you groomed, I guess. But, but it's interesting. It's interesting to think of that leadership, that hierarchy, because God is at the top and everybody else is scattered and doing their own work. But the work benefits the whole. It's not about people being over people or condescending on people, or that, to me, that illustration speaks volumes about what leadership should really look like.
I like that.
And when you take that, if C.S. Lewis was an elbow, he was just a great elbow, right?
He was the best elbow.
If you're a tooth, then be a great tooth. All jokes aside, that's sort of how it's supposed to operate. There's not supposed to be, there's not supposed to be a bone, telling off, the skin about something or whatever. It's not about that. And the minute that you get your ego involved, and you literally shift your eyes away from God, that's where the mischief starts. And so it's really about sort of keeping your eyes on God, which was something that he did so well, and that he constantly, was encouraging people to do, others to do.
And when people read this book, what do you hope that they get out of it? Now that you've finished this, like if you were to give this to someone, what would be your ideal circumstance?
I want them to embrace the opportunities they have to make the world better, which sounds really, when I say make the world better, make your circumstance better. I talk about the go light your corner statement, which is one of my professors always used he was a go light your corner. When you can't light the whole room, but you can light the corner you're in. And if you light that corner and other people see that light and want to be that light, then the whole room is brighter because of your one flame. So I want people to understand that, maybe you're not a CEO, but you're a parent. Maybe you're not a bank manager or whatever, but you're a teacher, a coach, a mentor. You're a youth pastor. You're a head pastor. You're a music minister. Whatever role you have, you embrace those opportunities to make people better and to make yourself better. So, and just, the whole, they talked about moral uplift in a lot of the leadership books. And that's really what it is. If we raise the bar, then the world cannot help but notice, the benefits of being, good and decent people.
Well, as someone who has read your book, I can say it's successful. And I'm not just saying that. I was going to mention that later, but I didn't know what to expect from the book. A book on Lewis and leadership. Is it more of an argument about Lewis is a good leader? Is it going to be more about leadership itself? I wasn't sure where it was going to fall on the spectrum, how it was going to weave it together. And I left it inspired to become a better person, honestly, and a better leader. Because the way you break it up, and you've already alluded to the different parts of it, from creativity to vision, morality, humility, and these different parts, the 10 different parts that you break it into. And you weave just so many beautiful examples, not only of Lewis and some of his works and some of the Narnia works. I remember the Reap a Cheap section on courage. It made me want to up my game, is probably the simplest way to say it. And I've walked away admiring Lewis more than I already did, because it's like, wow, he really did embody the best of these virtues. It made me realize that if I want to be a better person, just focus on becoming more virtuous. Don't overthink it. Focus on getting closer to stepping into the well or whatever it is, and just let that permeate you. And so I love that that's what your goal was, and that's what it was. That's what at least happened in my case.
Oh, that's great to hear. And I really do. I really love Reap Sheep. Okay, isn't he like the
He's always my
best?
favorite. That ending, I cried during the ending of that movie when he says, "This country is made for people with a heart like you." Oh,
I love it. And he's such a tiny creature, but he's so full of good and virtuous traits that that scene in the movie where he crosses over to Aslan's country is just, it gets me every time. And I love his courage is so apparent in that moment. He's so ready to go. He has no reluctance, no hesitation. He just wants to go. But I feel like, and one of the reasons I wrote the book was I wanted us to sort of understand that we have the power in ourselves to change culture for the good. And I have that quote at the beginning by Dorothy Sayers, which she wrote it in the voice of Lord Peter Wimsey, about let's not wait for the government to make all these policies to make our lives better. Let's get motivated to make culture better between all of us. Like, let's all decide corporately, right, to do something good and make the world better by embracing the things that we do, and the people that we love and that we serve, and that we work with. So that was sort of like that was sort of the impetus of what the book was about. And I was a little nervous because it's sort of a hybrid book. It's sort of a leadership study, if you've read leadership books, and it's sort of a biographical sketch of Lewis, and how he aligned with those traits. So I was a little nervous that people would say this is too Lewisy or this is too leadershipy.
I think that's what makes it powerful, is because if let's say you cut down the leadership side of it and you really just focused on these positive traits of Lewis, it would come across with less, I would argue, authority on the leadership side. I would be thinking it's a beautiful exposition of Lewis and what a great man he is. But by rooting it, what you did with the amount of the leadership side, it's so incredible of how much it really did just make me understand the depth of the leadership that's in Lewis. And I thought it made it even better. So I think he struck the perfect balance.
Oh, that's good to hear. And I wanted that practical research in there because I've had a lot of people say, I don't really see him as a leader. He just wrote some children's books, and you know how it is when somebody says, didn't he just write some children's books? And I'm like, how much time do you have? How much time do you have? Grab a
Lewis,
Snickers.
he's that Narnia guy, right?
And I'm like, oh my goodness, like, did he just write children's stories? No, he did not.
And they're children masterpieces, right? That's where you use that word differently.
Get me started. No, but it's interesting because I feel like I think writers especially have this unique access into our heads. They can plant worlds in our heads, right? I remember the first time that I watched Lord of the Rings. At that point, I hate to say this, but at that point, I actually hadn't read the books yet because this is very, very early in the 2000s. And I remember seeing the landscapes and just being completely enamored with the beauty and the brilliance of those landscapes. And to me, if you think about it, this was just what was in a man's head, right? And he wrote it down. How many people have been so inspired by those stories? How many people have opened up, a Lewis book or a Tolkien book and had their whole world changed? Because this man decided he was going to write something down. So in a way, I feel like writers are really are leaders because they're doing the same things that leaders do, right? Planning things and, trying to teach us how to do the right thing and putting ideas out there that, we should embrace and, It's not a lot of the heavy lifting necessarily. It's not, it's not like, you're going to write like a letter to Lewis and say, hey, what should I do about my pay raise? you know, a lot of people want to look at it from that practical level. But if you remember, Lewis Volume 3 is full of letters where people say, what should I do about my husband, or what should I do about my family? Or, he was a spiritual mentor to so many people during his time, and he felt obligated to write every single person back that wrote him, which was a huge duty to those people. And a lot of us, would probably say, I don't have time to do that. But he felt like they, yeah, Matt's like, me.
It made me feel real guilty.
No, it's okay. And I'm the same way. I've started using the flag thing a whole lot in my email. It's like, Crystal, you haven't replied to this yet. Crystal, you haven't replied to this yet. So it's interesting, but yeah, that's really the nuts and bolts of leadership, really, is just, doing the work, and being a moral person and having compassion and understanding and empathy. I think those are just important traits to have for effective leadership. And I was reading the other day in one of my leadership books, I think it was the Jeannie and Green book, which is a fabulous book, which is the 10 virtues for outstanding leadership, which is highly recommend that book. It's a great book by Jeannie and Green. And they said in there, this is such a great quote: putting someone in a position of power and calling them a leader is the same as handing somebody a Bible and putting them in the pulpit and calling them a preacher.
Whoa. I like that.
There's a whole aspect that you've neglected about having the calling and the training and the passion to do that job. So I feel like, wow, here's a man who would not want to be called a leader at all. And Steve Beebe very generously wrote the foreword for this book. And he even starts out by saying, C.S. Lewis would not call himself a leader at all. He would probably chuckle at it. But when we hold up his life and examine it, it meets all the marks for excellent leadership.
This might be a little bit of a tough question, maybe because you can't pick one thing, but from what you knew of leadership before this process and what you now know of leadership, having written an entire book on it, and Lewis, what surprised you from your previous understanding of leadership to what you learned and what you now know?
That's a great question. The process of researching underscored for me again the importance of being a good and virtuous human being as a prerequisite to being an effective leader.
I like that.
I talked some about the importance of morality and ethics in development of leadership, having that understanding of what is right and wrong. That to me, and not being clouded by the typical obstacles that we see in leadership, like privilege and the things that start tripping people up, that make people want to compromise their values. If you can withstand those issues and come out on the other side, then to me, you've done a wonderful job as a leader. Because leadership is hard. It's really hard. It's a lot of criticism and not a lot of praise. I mean, anybody who's been in a leadership position knows that.
There's so much responsibility that leads to a weight and a pressure. And in my experience in my own life, when there's an abnormal or an acute amount of pressure on my shoulders, that's when I am most vulnerable to sin, temptation, vices, and doing bad things and breaking integrity and things of that nature. And so you need a strong foundation to be able to handle those things. And that's honestly what's so encouraging about your book is you don't walk away thinking, I could never get those traits, because those are the things we're already called to in a Christian life. Like, when we think of Christ's grace and, as Lewis would argue, the divine life forming within us, as that divine life forms within us, these traits are going to begin naturally forming more and more and more. The foundation is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger. All of us can achieve this type of leadership, which is the authentic leadership, the real leadership, the transformational leadership, the servant leadership, to use some of the precise terms that you have in the beginning. And so it's so encouraging from that perspective. These are very attainable traits. They're not, oh, I have to be born with this natural ability or that natural ability to be a leader. No, you don't.
Right. Yeah, that was one thing that I think that really surprised me when I started my leadership program years ago. Was I was like, oh, but I'm not tall, and I don't like to speak in public. And, I had all these false notions of what a good leader is. And I referenced the great man theory, which was a prevalent theory early in Lewis's life, in the early in the 20th century. And it's ridiculous to think of it now. You have to be tall, you have to have a loud voice, you have to be extroverted. But anyway, I realized that just like little Reepicheep, there is no prerequisite for leadership. Just be an inspiring person. Just do the right thing.
Going back to your 1 Corinthians 12 too, it's, we've been talking a lot about the morality side of things, of being a good person, integrity, those kind of traits, and becoming that. You could also say, live out of the self that God intended you to be. So there's not only this become a good quality person, but live out of who you are. Stop trying to be someone else. Stop trying to be the extrovert, the charismatic public speaker. Yes, sometimes God has certain people designed for that. Great. They're going to do it. Sometimes he has someone designed to be an author. Sometimes he has someone designed to be a Reepicheep, small, but with a huge, courageous heart. Sometimes he's got a Mother Teresa that we can't do great things, but just small things with great love. Be who you are meant to be, your authentic self. Live with the morality, of course, and try to really strive for those virtues. And when those two bridge together, watch out to what Christ is going to do to you and the way he's going to use you to influence others for his kingdom.
Absolutely. And I mentioned Lewis's discussion of the Tao in this book.
Oh, yes. Forgot about that.
And that sort of his idea, it's the concept that like the universe has this flow of energy and creativity and all these things, and we just have to sort of acknowledge it and hook into it, which is sort of that's what the Tao talks about. And so I mentioned that's a lot like the incarnation, when we welcome into ourselves like this marvelous creative spirit, that shaped the worlds and shaped us. When we let that in and push out the nasty old yucky self that keeps trying to, crop up, we can do amazing, wonderful things. And we won't even care about, like in the chapter on humility, I talked about, we don't even care about ourselves. We're so focused on God and on other people. And that's to me, that would be such a great place to be mentally, is where you're so focused on other people that you're not even worried about who you impress, or if you got an invitation to so-and-so's party or whatever. Like, these things are small things in light of a larger kingdom that needs us to do some good work and get out there and be good people. And so we talk a lot about integrity and stuff. I think it's so important. And it's not just because it's about being decent people. To me, as an ambassador of the kingdom, that's my part of my job. Like, I've got to represent Christ in a good way, in an excellent way, because people need to see him through me. But I've got to let go and let him work right through me. He talks about, writing stories, he says, is a lot like that, which is interesting, which I put in the chapter on creativity, right? Like Lewis says, I didn't try to write a Christian story. I just try to write a great story, and I let God breathe through it. And, and then we have Narnia, right? And then we have the Ransom trilogy, and then, so
Great
it's sort of
metaphor
like,
for life.
yeah, I mean, it's so counterintuitive to us,
Mm-hmm.
that to surrender is the great gain. And so that, again, like you talked about at the beginning of the show, like leadership, you look at it from a totally different perspective, and that's what I think God wants us to do, is not take the world's way of looking at things. He wants to flip it and then have us examine how he really wanted it to look like. I mean, he wants us to look at how he created us and understand that leadership is not, it's tough, but it's not this impossible thing, because we are doing it every day. And in my own classroom, I had students several years ago write about their heroes. And I thought I was going to get a lot of essays on athletes and models and actresses and singers. And the majority of those essays were parents, grandparents, family members, coaches, and youth workers.
Wow.
Pastors.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah. And these are teenagers.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So you have no idea the impact you are having right now on somebody. But if you embrace it and understand it, it's like, wow.
I always think how cool it would be at the end of life to see the impact that you never saw. And then sometimes I think how scary that could be, because that can work in the negative sense too, the ripple effects. I'm like, I don't know if that would be a blessing or torture to me to be able to see all the impact I had, because I bet there is plenty of negative strunks out there, some word and sentence. But I do think about that, how it's like an iceberg, how much is below the sea that you just don't see and you'll never see, and how that will ripple.
Right.
And that thought, I like that thought because it challenges me to be more intentional on the day-to-day. So that way, hopefully that is more of a net positive, my impact, than a net negative.
And I think too, sometimes we can be hyper vigilant or very hyper aware of it. But one thing I learned about Lewis is one thing I learned from Lewis really during this book was just follow the instructions and I'll do the rest. Just obey. Yes. I will work it out for you. Right. And obeying is hard sometimes. We talk about loving our neighbors, and that's all of our neighbors. No matter what, if they
all
disagree with, yes, all of them. That's what the Bible says. It's interesting because, we're in a culture where people are like, but I disagree with so-and-so, or I don't agree with this, or, this is, I look around and I see God's beauty everywhere enraptured in all the diversity that we have in the kingdom here. The people that, like, God's family is so beautiful and diverse. And I think really that's a testament to God's creativity. And we need to look past those things that divide us, and come together and realize there's something so much bigger and more magnificent that brings us together. I live in a neighborhood where I'm a Tennessee fan because I graduated from the University of Tennessee. Okay. If you didn't detect it with my accent at all. And there's a lot of Alabama fans in my neighborhood.
She's like, no.
They are better than us. Okay. I'm just going to, listen, honesty is also one of those traits that's very important.
They crushed us, Notre Dame, in the national championship. So
yeah, they are better than us. Okay. I'll go on record on that one. But, it's funny how we hopefully not in a serious way, but we create these barriers, all the time, of disagreement and stuff, and they're just silly small things, but in the long run, one thing God has worked with me on the last couple of years is like, gosh, man, just love people. That's all I've asked you to do. Love me and love your neighbor. That's what I want you to do. And I'm like, well, loving you is fine. Loving everyone else is a little harder. But at the end of the day, when you start sort of seeing, just like Lewis talks about, there are no mere mortals. The moment that you start seeing people as like these beings that God created, even if they're pulling for a different football team than you or whatever, they vote for a different political party or whatever. When you start seeing them as God sees them, it transforms the way that you treat others and that you see the world.
I love that. And as we approach the 60-minute marker, I think that is a beautiful way to wrap up the main part of our discussion. But before we turn to the ending, where can listeners find out more? Let's start with the book, but then you, because I have a feeling after listening to this, they're going to want to go figure out where that book is. So yeah, where can they find that out and more about you?
So the book is called The Leadership of C.S. Lewis, 10 Traits to Encourage Change and Growth. It's available through all major retail distributors, published by Wingline Press. So that will be available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, places like that. We also do have it in ebook form because I've had folks ask about that. I actually have a blog, crystalhurd.com, that I occasionally write on. Occasionally, like I said, because I'm working on some other things with
You've been a little busy.
Yeah. I'm working on the book on the family very slowly too, which has been a lot of fun. That his family, C.S. Lewis's family, was an absolute hoot. They are a great bunch of people, and I can't wait to tell you some of the stories I've uncovered in the Lewis papers and stuff. Great stuff.
Oh, we can't wait to have you on to talk about that.
They are
round 3.
Hey, I love it. I love Pints with Jack, but they were an amazing group of people. I mean, this is why C.S. Lewis is C.S. Lewis. He was molded by a lot of really great, amazing people. But I've been working on that. I also do some work at Zenzucht, the C.S. Lewis Journal. I'm the reviews editor there, and so I've done some articles and stuff. I was in the last issue of Christian History Magazine writing on the family, which was a lot of fun.
Oh, no way. Isn't Chris Armstrong, wasn't he with Christian History Magazine?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I had a chance to interview him maybe last year. That was a fun interview to be able to do.
It's my newest issue on divine healing and stuff just came in today. It's a great magazine. Great magazine.
Title, Divine Healing.
Yeah, it's really great. I'm also on Twitter at Dr. Hurd, DoctorHurd, and Instagram, and all that fun stuff. I'm not on like Reddit or any of that stuff.
I don't go down that path.
Whatever the people in the mid-40s do, that's what I do. Yeah, kids are like, "Oh, you on
MySpace?"
Oh no, I think I abandoned my MySpace a few years ago. I'm a little bit hipper.
David went backwards and created one for Pints with Jack last year just for fun.
Wow, yeah. I'm pretty sure mine's been closed for, I don't even know, probably 10 years or something now. So you can check me out on those places, and I teach at Northwind Theological Seminary also. We have programs that are open for folks who want to study the Inklings or influence of the Inklings. So, you can always shoot me a message, anything like that. I try to, I may not answer every single email I get, something like Lewis, but I do try to answer all the messages I get. Thank you so much for having me on here, Matt. It's been absolutely wonderful.
Well, thank you for coming on, and thank you for sharing all this wisdom with the listeners and sharing about your book. And thank you for the work that you put into the Lewis community. I mean, just to be able to read this book, for a reader, we'll read it, and we get all of this benefit that is condensed from 10 years of research. I mean, sometimes we don't realize what a gift it is to have so much packed into such a concise, clear message. Like that doesn't just happen from someone just deciding to sit down for 3 months and write a book. That takes a lot of planning. So thank you for that too. And as we wrap this up, we want to thank all our listeners, our Patreon supporters, and particularly our top tier ones, Emmy, Thomas, Deborah, Nani Mouse, Billy, Bill and Joanna, Snort, Bud, Shane, John, Kevin, Brian, K, Paul, Kimberly, Gillis, Gary, Stephen, Matt, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, and Rowdy. Chris has never heard the Snort. We had a call with him. There's a great story with that. His name's not Snort. We weren't sure it was a nickname. He goes, I just didn't want to put my real name into it, so I picked the first thing that came to my mind. And so now we love it, and we just keep Snort in there. It was so great. And then I think it was once that Andrew for Anonymous decided to go Anani Mouse. And so now we always do that one. Oh, it's just kind of stuck.
That's funny.
Yeah. But listeners, if you go check this out, we will put a link to most likely the Amazon one, nice and easy. Throw that in our show notes, and then you guys can just click that and buy that. And you can do that one click, send it right to your house. Nice and easy. And check us out, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, MySpace, got them all. Write a review if you enjoy this. And please join us next time when we'll be going further up.
And further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.